world's largest economies have entered a fraught contest of wills, with trade disputes surging to unprecedented heights. What began as a series of punitive levies has morphed into a full-blown escalation, drawing in allies and adversaries alike. Where once modest duties set a modest tone, the burden on Chinese imports has swelled dramatically, signaling a shift from negotiation to confrontation. Just weeks ago, the average surcharge on goods arriving from China hovered around mid-double digits. Today, that figure has effectively tripled, imposing a heavy new cost on any company hoping to tap into American consumers. Far from being an isolated skirmish, this surge in tariff rates underscores a strategic decision to dismantle long-standing supply chains and compel nations to reconsider their economic allegiances. Beijing's response has been swift and pointed. Rather than acquiesce quietly, Chinese officials have gone on the offensive, dispatching cautions to capitals in Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. Their message: any new arrangement with Washington that undermines China's interests will carry consequences. Emboldened by this rhetoric, policymakers in Beijing have seized their moment to recast the dispute as a matter of international principle, rather than mere commercial friction. In an extraordinary maneuver, China has invoked the United Nations' highest security forum, demanding a special session dedicated to what it calls the perils of economic coercion. Within diplomatic corridors, colleagues whispered disbelief at the irony. A regime known for exerting pressure on dissidents and neighboring states, now leading a campaign against another democracy for purportedly bullying tactics. Yet for China, the optics of convening a council meeting carry a potent symbolism, an attempt to rally dependents and fence-sitters to its cause. Meanwhile, New Delhi has emerged as a pivotal actor in this unfolding drama. Fresh off a high-profile visit from a senior U.S. envoy, India announced plans to boost its purchases from America and simultaneously rein in imports from China. Tariffs on Chinese steel have climbed, ostensibly to shield domestic producers from artificially low prices backstopped by state subsidies. This pivot has unnerved Beijing, which had counted on India's neutrality at best or tacit support at worst. Washington's architects of policy recognize that the battle extends far beyond direct shipments from China. By targeting goods routed through intermediary markets, where labels are swapped to evade duties, the United States aims to close every loophole. The directive is simple yet uncompromising. Partners must not become conduits for tariff dodging. Any nation that fails to enforce these rules risks exclusion from the broader coalition seeking to discipline Beijing. As accusations and counter-accusations ricochet between capitals, the narrative of economic bullying has taken center stage. China castigates the United States for weaponizing trade tools to disrupt global stability, while U.S. officials point to instances of intimidation carried out by the Chinese Communist Party, whether against minority populations, neighboring states, or elected candidates abroad. Each side frames its actions as defensive necessities rather than aggressive power plays. Amidst this escalating contest, questions have surfaced about the integrity of democratic processes. Canadian authorities, for instance, have flagged interference aimed at influencing election outcomes, attributing such campaigns to agents sympathetic to Beijing's objectives. Social platforms have been cited as vectors for disinformation, eroding trust in candidates critical of China's human rights record. Against this backdrop, high-level diplomacy has taken on renewed urgency. A U.S. delegation's trip to New Delhi underscored mutual ambitions to broaden bilateral trade, even as hurdles remain over market access for goods ranging from automobiles to e-commerce services. Formal terms of reference have been laid out, carving a path toward more detailed negotiations. Both sides speak of doubling trade volumes within the decade, but the substance of those discussions will test the resolve of governments still wary of disrupting domestic industries. While China's aggressive diplomacy struggled to gain traction, the United States continued to build momentum. India's recent moves had sparked a chain reaction across the region. Nations that once hesitated to align openly with the U.S. were now weighing their options more seriously. In Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, despite their complicated histories with China, recognized an opportunity. The optics of cooperation with Xi Jinping might have looked good for headlines, but the reality on the ground told a different story. Vietnam's swift purchase of American fighter jets after Xi's visit sent a clear message. Security and economic independence mattered more than appeasing Beijing. Meanwhile, China's attempts to punish the U.S. by rejecting Boeing orders seemed to backfire almost immediately. Planes once destined for Chinese airlines were now being snapped up by countries eager to avoid multi-year waiting lists. Malaysia and India, among others, saw a chance to strengthen their air fleets without the usual delays. The move unintentionally boosted Boeing's standing, highlighting how China's retaliation efforts were doing more harm to itself than to its intended target. In trying to weaken U.S. industries, Beijing inadvertently opened doors for American allies to grow stronger. At the core of this shifting landscape was the United States' quiet but strategic diplomacy. Rather than relying solely on confrontations, Washington made it clear to potential partners that cooperation came with tangible benefits. A country willing to match U.S. tariffs on China would in turn receive favorable trade terms. It was a straightforward pitch. Stand with the U.S. against China's unfair trade practices, and you'll gain better access to the world's largest consumer market. In contrast, China's offers were increasingly seen as hollow or coercive. This approach revealed a key weakness in China's strategy. While Xi tried to rally countries against U.S. tariffs, he underestimated the deep-seated mistrust many nations held toward Beijing's ambitions. From territorial disputes in the South China Sea to economic bullying tactics against smaller nations, China had spent years building resentment. Now, when it needed allies the most, it found few who were willing to stand firmly at its side. Even Cambodia and Malaysia, which had previously enjoyed close relations with China, appeared cautious. The promises of lucrative deals weren't enough to erase concerns about sovereignty, debt traps, and political meddling. Adding to China's challenges was its domestic situation. The Chinese economy, already burdened by demographic decline and slowing growth, could ill afford a protracted trade war. Manufacturing sectors heavily dependent on U.S. consumers started to feel the pinch. Companies began shifting production to other countries like Vietnam and India, a trend that undermined China's role as the world's factory floor. The longer the conflict dragged on, the clearer it became that the cost of isolation could be catastrophic for Beijing. Yet, China's leadership refused to back down publicly. They doubled down on nationalist rhetoric, painting the U.S. as the aggressor and themselves as defenders of a fair global order. This narrative might have resonated domestically, but internationally, it lacked credibility. The irony of a regime known for censorship, territorial aggression, and economic coercion calling out bullying did not go unnoticed by global observers. In many ways, China's insistence on playing the victim while simultaneously behaving like a bully only alienated more countries. As alliances quietly realigned, Washington's broader strategy of containment through partnership took shape. By making economic cooperation contingent on resisting Chinese pressure, the U.S. was creating a web of interconnected agreements that left China fewer places to turn. In India, this meant deepening trade discussions. In Vietnam, it meant expanding security cooperation. In Canada and Europe, it meant exposing and countering election interference and propaganda efforts. Every move added another thread to the tightening net around Beijing's ambitions. And while Xi Jinping sought headlines with grand summits and lavish promises, the real shift was happening behind closed doors, in quiet trade negotiations, defense deals, and shared security commitments. The world wasn't turning against China because Washington forced it to. It was turning because, when given a choice, more nations decided they were better off standing with the U.S. than risking entanglement with an increasingly desperate Beijing. The cumulative effect of these shifts began to manifest in ways Beijing could no longer ignore. One by one, key economies in Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe started diversifying away from Chinese investments and supply chains. The much-touted Belt and Road Initiative, once a centerpiece of China's global influence campaign, encountered growing resistance. Countries burdened with unsustainable debts, like Sri Lanka and Kenya, became cautionary tales for others. Governments that once eagerly signed infrastructure deals with Beijing were now demanding renegotiations or turning to alternative funding from the U.S., Japan, or multilateral institutions like the World Bank. Beijing's usual playbook of offering easy credit and promising rapid development lost its appeal. In a world increasingly wary of China's intentions, no strings attached deals were now seen as ticking time bombs rather than golden opportunities. Even nations still doing business with China began hedging their bets, ensuring that they had viable alternatives should relations sour. Supply chains that had once flowed seamlessly through Chinese ports started to reroute through India, Vietnam, and even Mexico. American companies, once reluctant to leave the lucrative Chinese market, now found political and financial incentives to move operations elsewhere. At the same time, China's internal challenges grew more acute. The property sector, a major driver of Chinese economic growth for decades, remained mired in crisis. Youth unemployment hovered at record highs, despite government efforts to mask the numbers. The Chinese middle class, once a symbol of rising prosperity, faced stagnating incomes and growing disillusionment. Xi's emphasis on common prosperity and tighter control over private enterprise only worsened the situation, stifling innovation and prompting an exodus of entrepreneurs and tech talent. Diplomatically, China's heavy-handed tactics also backfired. Efforts to intimidate Taiwan with military drills only strengthened international sympathy for the island. European nations, already alarmed by China's support for Russia during its invasion of Ukraine, hardened their stance. Even traditionally neutral countries like Switzerland began rethinking their relationships with Beijing. Rather than isolating the United States, China found itself increasingly isolated. Still, Xi Jinping showed no signs of changing course. His leadership style, shaped by ideology and a deep sense of historical grievance, prioritized perceived strength over strategic flexibility. Any concession, however minor, was framed as a potential weakness. This rigidity made negotiations nearly impossible and led many foreign leaders to conclude that betting on China's reasonableness was a losing game. Meanwhile, the United States, despite its own domestic political challenges, managed to maintain a relatively consistent foreign policy toward China. Across Republican and Democratic administrations alike, there was bipartisan consensus that Beijing represented the chief strategic threat of the 21st century. This consistency gave Washington an advantage. Allies knew that America's stance on China wouldn't easily change with every election cycle. By the end of the year, the new geopolitical reality was unmistakable. China remained a major global power, but not an uncontested one. The dream of a Chinese-led global order, which had once seemed plausible in some circles, now looked increasingly out of reach. Instead, the world was moving toward a fragmented but resilient system, where American influence, though imperfect, remained the cornerstone of global stability.